Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most profound and transformative teachings of Buddhism, something that touches each of us, no matter our background, beliefs, or where we come from. I'm talking about the nature of life, death, and what happens when we take our last breath. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, death? Really? But trust me, this isn't going to be a depressing talk. Quite the opposite. What we're about to explore might just change the way you think about your life and the way you approach every moment. Death, in Buddhism, is not something to fear. It's not an end. It's a transition. It's part of a natural cycle, a journey that continues beyond what we can see, beyond this body, beyond this life. Imagine living every day with a sense of peace, knowing that death isn't the final curtain, but just another step in the endless flow of existence. How would that change how you live right now? How would that shape your relationships, your choices, your mindset? In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into how Buddhism views death, rebirth, and karma, not just as a religious philosophy, but as a practical way to live a more meaningful, ethical, and mindful life. I'll share stories, insights, and examples that will help you understand why these ancient teachings are just as relevant today as they were when the Buddha first spoke them. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll look at life and death through a whole new lens. But before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready to dive into these life-changing concepts. Share this video with anyone you think might find it interesting, and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking content every week. Now, let's get started. And I promise, you're going to want to stick around for this one. In Buddhism, death is not viewed as the final end of existence, but as part of an ongoing cycle of life, death, and rebirth known as samsara. This cycle is propelled by karma, a law of cause and effect that governs not only our actions, but also the very conditions of our existence. While the concept of death often evokes fear and uncertainty for many people, Buddhism offers a radically different perspective, one that encourages us to view death as a transition, not an end. By embracing the truths of impermanence, non-self, and karma, Buddhism teaches us how to live more mindfully, act with compassion, and prepare for death with a sense of peace and understanding. Buddhism's view of death is rooted in the understanding of impermanence, or anicca. The Buddha repeatedly emphasized that everything in life, from our bodies to our relationships, is subject to change. All conditioned things are impermanent, the Buddha taught. The very nature of life itself is one of constant flux. Birth, aging, illness, and death are not aberrations or signs of failure. They are simply part of the natural process. When we accept the impermanence of life, we come to realize that clinging to anything, whether it is life itself or material possessions, causes suffering. By understanding this, we learn to approach life with greater equanimity, letting go of attachment to things that are fleeting. Take, for example, the way we often view our bodies. From a Buddhist perspective, our bodies are not something permanent or unchanging, but a collection of constantly shifting element cells, tissues, and atoms. If we closely examine the impermanence of our physical selves, we may come to understand that death is not something to fear, but simply a natural transition. Imagine you've spent years tending to a garden. The flowers bloom, grow, and eventually fade. As the petals fall away, new seeds are planted, beginning the cycle once again. In the same way, death is not an ending but a moment of transition that allows for new growth. In addition to impermanence, Buddhism teaches the concept of non-self, or anatta. The Buddha taught that there is no permanent, unchanging self within us. What we perceive as our identity is simply a collection of physical and mental processes that are constantly changing. When we think of ourselves, we often imagine a core, unchanging essence at the heart of our being. However, Buddhism challenges this notion. What we think of as self is not an eternal soul or permanent identity, but rather a dynamic combination of constantly evolving mental and physical phenomena. This understanding helps us release the fear of death because, in essence, there is no permanent self to lose. For instance, consider a car. A car is made up of various parts: wheels, doors, engine, and so on. It is not the case that there is a car somewhere inside the parts. The car is simply the collection of those parts working together. In the same way, our identity is not a singular, unchanging entity, but a collection of ever-changing mental and physical elements. The death of the body, then, does not signify the death of the self, because that self was never truly permanent in the first place. When we apply this understanding to death, we realize that death is simply the cessation of a particular combination of physical and mental processes, not the annihilation of a soul or permanent identity. Once we grasp this truth, we can begin to let go of the fear of losing something that was never truly ours to begin with. Death, in this sense, is not a final, frightening event, but a natural part of the ongoing flow of existence. The concept of karma plays a central role in Buddhism's understanding of death and rebirth. Karma is often misunderstood as a simplistic idea of reward and punishment, but it is much more profound. Karma refers to the intentional actions we take, our thoughts, words, and deeds, and the consequences they bring. These actions are like seeds that we plant, and in time, they bear fruit, either in this life or in future lives. Karma is not something external that is imposed upon us, but rather the natural law of cause and effect. The Buddha famously said, "Beings are the owners of their actions, the heirs of their actions." This means that our actions, whether positive or negative, determine the quality of our future experiences. For instance, if someone consistently acts with kindness, compassion, and generosity, they will sow the seeds for a future that is rich in joy and peace. On the other hand, if someone consistently acts with hatred, greed, and cruelty, they will sow the seeds for a future filled with suffering. This is not to say that karma is deterministic or fixed, but that our present actions shape the conditions of our future. The law of karma helps us understand the cycle of samsara, which is the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The Buddha taught that our actions, both positive and negative, shape the circumstances of our next life. This is why karma is so important in the Buddhist view of death. Death is not an end, but a transition to a new life. And the quality of that life is determined by the karma accumulated in previous lives. In Buddhist teachings, the cycle of rebirth is often depicted as a wheel, known as the Wheel of Samsara, which is divided into 6 realms: the heavenly realm, the human realm, the realm of the asuras, demigods, the animal realm, the realm of hungry ghosts, and the hell realms. These realms are not physical places but represent states of being or consciousness that are influenced by our karma. For example, a person who lives a life of generosity and compassion may be reborn in a heavenly realm, while a person who lives a life of hatred and cruelty may be reborn in one of the hell realms. The human realm is considered particularly precious because it offers the opportunity to practice the Dharma and work toward liberation from samsara. The Buddhist teachings on karma emphasize that rebirth is not a random or arbitrary process. It is governed by the law of cause and effect, and the actions we take in this life directly impact our future. As the Buddha said, what we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. This teaching encourages us to live with awareness, knowing that every action we take has consequences not only for ourselves but for others as well. In addition to understanding the nature of death and rebirth, Buddhism offers practical tools for preparing for death in a way that aligns with the Dharma. One of the most important practices is mindfulness, or being fully present in the moment. By cultivating mindfulness in our daily lives, we learn to be aware of our thoughts, words, and deeds, and we can make choices that are in harmony with our highest values. This practice of mindfulness also helps us prepare for death, as it allows us to face the inevitable with clarity and peace, free from fear or attachment. Another key practice for preparing for death is meditation. Meditation helps calm the mind and cultivate insight into the nature of reality. The Buddha emphasized the importance of meditation, saying, "Meditate, monks, do not delay, lest you later regret it." Through meditation, we can gain insight into the impermanent nature of all things, including our own lives. By reflecting on the inevitability of death, we can deepen our appreciation for life and let go of attachment to transient things. This practice of mindfulness and meditation helps us approach death not as a frightening unknown, but as a natural part of the cycle of existence. The cultivation of merit is also an important practice in Buddhism, particularly in relation to death. Merit refers to the positive spiritual energy generated through wholesome actions, such as generosity, ethical conduct, and meditation. By accumulating merit throughout our lives, we create the conditions for a peaceful death and a favorable rebirth. The Buddha taught that acts of generosity not only benefit others, but also purify the mind of the giver, creating a sense of peace and fulfillment. Compassion is another essential quality that Buddhism encourages us to cultivate as we prepare for death. The Buddha taught that hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. A compassionate heart, free from resentment or ill will, is a heart that can let go gracefully at the moment of death. By practicing loving kindness, metta, and compassion, karuna, we soften our hearts and reduce the fear and anxiety that often accompany the thought of dying. As we reflect on death, we realize that our understanding of it shapes the way we live our lives. By embracing the Buddhist teachings on death, rebirth, and karma, we can approach life with greater wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness. Death is not something to be feared, but something to be understood and prepared for. By living ethically, cultivating mindfulness, and practicing compassion, we can transform our relationship with death, allowing us to live more fully and die with peace. The ultimate goal of Buddhism is liberation from samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This liberation is known as nirvana, a state beyond suffering and the extinction of the causes of samsara ignorance, craving, and aversion. Through the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, we can break free from the cycle of samsara and attain the freedom of nirvana. The Buddhist teachings offer us a path toward this liberation, a path that begins with the understanding of death and the cultivation of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. By following this path, we can transcend the fear of death and live with a sense of peace, knowing that death is not an end, but a natural transition in the ongoing flow of existence. In Buddhism, death is not perceived as the definitive end of existence, but rather as a transition and inevitable, natural part of the ongoing flow of life. This view stems from the fundamental Buddhist teachings on impermanence, anicca, and non-self, anatta. To understand how these concepts shape the Buddhist perspective on death, it's crucial to first examine the way the Buddha viewed the nature of life itself. Life, according to Buddhist philosophy, is in a state of constant flux, much like a river that continuously flows, never remaining the same for even a single moment. Just as a river does not pause, life, our experiences, our bodies, our emotions flows ceaselessly, changing from one moment to the next. Death is not an interruption of this flow, but a natural continuation of it. The Buddha's teaching on impermanence is central to this understanding. When he says, "All conditioned things are impermanent," he is pointing to the fundamental nature of everything we experience. This includes not only physical objects like our bodies and our possessions, but also our thoughts, relationships, and even the very fabric of our identity. Nothing in the world, the Buddha teaches, remains unchanged forever. Everything is subject to birth, decay, and death. The moment we come to grips with the truth of impermanence, we begin to shift our relationship with the world around us. We stop clinging to things, ideas, and relationships as if they were permanent fixtures in our lives. This change in perspective does not lead to nihilism or apathy, but rather to greater peace and understanding. We begin to embrace life more fully, knowing that everything, including ourselves, is in a constant state of change. By accepting impermanence, we are better prepared for the moment of death. The fear of death often arises from our attachment to the things we hold dear: our bodies, our loved ones, and our identities. If we accept that these things are not permanent, the anxiety around their eventual loss diminishes. The Buddha's teachings encourage us to confront the inevitability of change, not with fear or denial, but with mindfulness and acceptance. This is not to say that we should be indifferent to life or avoid forming deep, meaningful relationships. Rather, it invites us to engage with life fully, appreciating it for what it is in the present moment, without the burden of clinging to an illusion of permanence. To further elaborate on this teaching, consider the example of a tree's leaves. In autumn, the leaves fall to the ground, a process that may seem tragic or final from a human perspective. However, this act is part of the tree's life cycle. The leaves falling does not signify their end, but a transition that allows for new growth. Just as a tree's leaves fall to the ground to nourish new growth, so too does death play a role in the broader cycle of existence. When we view death as a natural transition, rather than an end, we can approach it with a sense of acceptance and peace. It is simply a necessary part of life's continuous flow. The Buddhist teachings offer us a profound way of thinking about death as an integral part of the cycle, not something to be feared or resisted. The concept of non-self, or anatta, adds another layer to this understanding. According to the Buddha, the self, we cling to the sense of an unchanging, permanent identity is an illusion. We are not fixed entities, but a collection of constantly changing physical and mental elements. Our thoughts, emotions, and bodies are all in a perpetual state of flux. There is no permanent, unchanging self that remains intact through the course of our lives. The Buddhist teachings on non-self challenge our deeply ingrained belief that there is a constant, enduring I at the core of our being. This self, which we so often defend and protect, does not actually exist as we imagine it. When we apply the understanding of non-self to death, we begin to realize that the fear of death is rooted in our attachment to this false sense of a permanent self. If there is no enduring, unchanging self, then death does not represent the loss of an eternal essence. It is simply the cessation of a particular configuration of physical and mental processes. Just as a wave rises and falls on the surface of the ocean, our lives rise and fall in the great flow of existence. The wave is not separate from the ocean, nor is our life separate from the larger stream of life that flows through all beings. Once we understand that the self we cling to is not as permanent or independent as we think, we begin to approach death with greater clarity and peace. The fear of losing something that was never truly ours to begin with dissipates. An example of this teaching can be seen in the metaphor of a chariot. The Buddha uses this analogy to explain the concept of non-self. A chariot is composed of several parts: wheels, axles, a frame, and so on. These individual parts make up the chariot. But there is no chariot in the way we commonly think of it. There is no single, unchanging essence of chariot. It is simply a collection of parts working together in a particular way. In the same way, our identity is not a fixed, unchanging entity, but a constantly evolving collection of physical and mental elements. The death of the body, therefore, is not the death of the self, because the self is not an enduring, unchanging essence in the first place. This understanding of non-self also has a practical implication in how we deal with death in our daily lives. When we release our attachment to a permanent self, we no longer need to hold on to the illusion that we are invulnerable or immortal. This allows us to live with greater humility and wisdom, understanding that life is a gift that is transient and precious. Moreover, by letting go of our attachment to the idea of a permanent self, we also let go of the fear of losing that self in death. If there is no permanent self to lose, then death does not need to be feared. The acceptance of impermanence and the realization of non-self are the cornerstones of the Buddhist approach to death. When we fully internalize these teachings, we develop a deeper sense of peace and equanimity. We begin to view death not as something to be feared or avoided, but as a natural and inevitable transition. The practice of these teachings is not limited to death itself, but informs the way we live our lives. By accepting the impermanence of life, we are encouraged to live with more mindfulness, making the most of each moment. We are less likely to take things for granted, knowing that they are fleeting. We can approach our relationships with greater openness, understanding that they, too, are subject to change. Consider the way we interact with others. If we understand the impermanent nature of all things, we may find ourselves less attached to the need to control or possess others. We may be more accepting of their flaws, knowing that both they and we are constantly changing. In this sense, death is not the only thing that can help us develop a sense of equanimity. The realization of impermanence allows us to develop a more profound and compassionate way of relating to others, free from the illusions of permanence and control. Death is also seen as a moment for reflection and understanding. In Buddhism, we are encouraged to meditate on the impermanent nature of life and death, which can help us cultivate a deep sense of gratitude for the present moment. When we reflect on the fact that death is inevitable, we are reminded of the preciousness of life itself. This reflection helps us focus on what truly matters: our relationships, our actions, and our intentions. We become more attuned to the importance of living a virtuous life, cultivating positive qualities such as kindness, generosity, and compassion. Ultimately, understanding death in this way enables us to live more fully and with greater wisdom, knowing that every moment is a gift that will not last forever. In the Buddhist view, death is not the final chapter in the story of existence. Instead, it marks a continuation of the flow of consciousness. This concept of rebirth differs significantly from the notion of reincarnation found in other religious traditions, where the soul or essence is believed to pass unchanged from one body to another. In Buddhism, there is no permanent, unchanging soul, no fixed self that transitions from one life to the next. Instead, rebirth is understood as the continuation of consciousness itself, a process that is deeply influenced by the law of karma, which governs the ethical consequences of our actions, thoughts, and intentions. The analogy the Buddha often used to explain rebirth is that of a flame. Imagine a candle burning, and then using that flame to light another candle. The second flame is not the same as the first, but it arises because of it. It is a continuation, but not an identical duplication. Similarly, in Buddhism, consciousness at death does not simply cease to exist, nor does it pass unchanged into a new body. Instead, the consciousness continues, influenced by the karma accumulated in previous lives. This notion of consciousness as a stream is crucial to understanding the Buddhist teaching on rebirth. The Buddha likened consciousness to a river, ever flowing, always changing, and never static. Like a river that flows from one moment to the next, consciousness is shaped by past actions, thoughts, and desires. The Buddhist teachings emphasize that our consciousness is not an isolated entity, but rather part of an interconnected process of cause and effect. Just as the river is shaped by the land it flows over, our consciousness is shaped by the karmic actions we engage in during our lives. The conditions in which our consciousness is reborn are the direct result of the actions, thoughts, and intentions we have cultivated throughout our existence. The concept of karma plays a vital role in understanding how rebirth operates in Buddhism. Karma, in its most basic sense, refers to the law of cause and effect. The actions we take, whether good or bad, create consequences that influence the course of our future lives. These actions are not simply physical acts. They also encompass our speech, thoughts, and intentions. Every action, whether intentional or not, leaves an imprint on our consciousness. These imprints are like seeds planted in the soil of our mind, which will eventually bear fruit in future moments of our lives. This is where the concept of rebirth and karma intersect. The type of consciousness we experience in our future lives is shaped by the seeds we plant in this life. Our thoughts, words, and actions in the present moment have a direct impact on the form and circumstances of our future existence. If we plant seeds of kindness, generosity, and compassion, we will likely experience a future rebirth that is aligned with these positive qualities. If, on the other hand, we plant seeds of greed, hatred, and delusion, our future rebirth will be shaped by these negative traits. Consider the analogy of planting seeds in a garden. If you plant seeds for tomatoes, you will, eventually, harvest tomatoes. If you plant seeds for roses, you will get roses. Similarly, every thought, word, and deed is a seed that will grow into something in the future, whether that future is in this life or the next. The seeds of our actions shape the future of our consciousness, determining the conditions of our rebirth. This process is not random. nor is it subject to chance. The law of karma ensures that our actions, whether positive or negative, create corresponding consequences. Just as a gardener cannot plant seeds of bitterness and expect to harvest sweetness, a person cannot cultivate negative mental states and expect to experience positive outcomes in the future. The Buddha taught that the nature of our rebirth is not determined by a divine being or external force, but by our own actions and intentions. In other words, we are the creators of our own destiny. The law of karma operates independently of any judgment or divine will. It is simply a natural law of cause and effect. This gives us a profound sense of responsibility for the choices we make in our lives. Every moment is an opportunity to plant new seeds in the garden of our consciousness. It's important to note that rebirth, in the Buddhist view, is not about a soul or permanent identity being transferred from one life to another. It's not like a suitcase that you pack with your experiences and carry with you into a new life. Rather, it is a continuation of the process of becoming. The continuity of consciousness does not imply that there is an unchanging, permanent self moving through different lives. Instead, it suggests that the actions we take, the thoughts we cultivate, and the intentions we hold have a profound effect on the ongoing process of our existence. Rebirth is the continuation of a stream, shaped by the causes and conditions that have come before it. In this context, the concept of self becomes more fluid. In Buddhism, the self is not a fixed, permanent entity. The notion of a permanent self or soul is considered an illusion, a misperception of the nature of existence. The Buddha's teaching on non-self, anatta, reminds us that there is no eternal, unchanging essence that persists through multiple lifetimes. Rather, there are simply ever-changing aggregates of physical and mental phenomena, our bodies, feelings, perceptions, and consciousness. These aggregates come together for a time, and then they dissolve, only to reassemble in a new form, influenced by the actions and intentions we have cultivated in the past. To understand rebirth fully, we must also look at the Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination, padakasamuppada, which describes the interdependent nature of all phenomena. According to this teaching, everything arises because of causes and conditions, and everything is interconnected. Our actions, thoughts, and intentions are not isolated, but are part of a larger web of causality that extends through time. Just as a seed cannot grow without the right conditions, soil, water, and sunlight, our consciousness cannot be reborn without the appropriate conditions. These conditions are shaped by our previous actions, which are the seeds we have planted in our lives. This brings us back to the concept of karma, which serves as the key to understanding the continuity of consciousness. Karma is not a form of divine retribution, nor is it a deterministic force that traps us in a cycle of suffering. Rather, it is simply the natural law of cause and effect. If we act with kindness, we are more likely to be reborn into circumstances that allow for further opportunities to cultivate positive qualities. If we act with selfishness or malice, we are more likely to be reborn into situations that reinforce these negative traits. In this way, karma shapes the course of our lives, and our rebirth is a direct reflection of the karmic seeds we have planted. An important aspect of this teaching is that karma is not limited to actions in this life alone. The actions we take in one life can have an impact on the next. This is why the process of rebirth is not random or arbitrary, but is deeply tied to the way we live our lives. The Buddha encouraged his followers to live ethically, to practice mindfulness, and to cultivate wisdom. By doing so, we can shape the course of our future rebirths in a positive direction, ensuring that we continue to grow and evolve spiritually. In this sense, rebirth is not simply a metaphysical concept. It is also a practical and ethical guide for how we live our lives. It encourages us to take responsibility for our actions and to recognize that the way we live today will shape the conditions of our future existence. This understanding can help us live more mindfully, with greater awareness of the impact of our thoughts, words, and deeds. The practice of cultivating good karma, or virtuous actions, is at the heart of Buddhist ethics. It's not just about avoiding bad actions or harm, but about actively engaging in the world with compassion, generosity, and wisdom. Every positive action we take, whether it's helping a neighbor, speaking kindly, or cultivating a peaceful mind, creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond the immediate moment. These actions accumulate over time, shaping the future of our consciousness and determining the circumstances of our rebirth. This understanding of rebirth and karma challenges the common view of life and death as isolated events. Rather than seeing death as a final endpoint, Buddhism invites us to see it as a part of a larger process of becoming. Life is not just about one brief existence. It is about the continuous unfolding of consciousness, shaped by our actions and intentions across multiple lifetimes. Each life is an opportunity to plant seeds of virtue, to cultivate wisdom, and to continue the journey toward enlightenment. In the end, the Buddhist teaching on rebirth offers us a profound way to understand our lives. It encourages us to recognize the interconnectedness of all beings and to live with greater mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. By understanding the continuity of consciousness and the law of karma, we can approach life and death with a sense of purpose and peace, knowing that every thought, word, and action has the potential to shape our future, not just in this life, but in the lives to come. Karma is a central concept in Buddhist philosophy, often misunderstood as a simplistic notion of reward and punishment for good and bad deeds. But the Buddhist understanding of karma is far more profound and nuanced than the common view. It extends beyond the idea of a cosmic scoreboard, keeping track of whether one has done more good than bad in life. In Buddhism, karma refers to the intentional actions, whether physical, verbal, or mental, that we take. And it is these actions, driven by intention, that leave imprints on our consciousness. These imprints accumulate and shape our future experiences, influencing not just the quality of our present life, but the nature of our future rebirths as well. The key to understanding karma in Buddhism is intention. It's not just about the outward act, but the inner motivation behind it. Two people can perform the same action, yet the karmic result can differ dramatically based on the intention that guided the action. For example, imagine two people donating money to a charity. One person donates out of genuine compassion, hoping to help others and ease their suffering. The other person donates with the intent of impressing others or gaining social status. While the outward action may appear the same, the first person is accumulating positive karma, whereas the second person is cultivating negative karma, because their action is motivated by selfish desire and pride. This distinction highlights the importance of the mental state behind the action, not just the action itself. The Buddhist teachings about karma emphasize that the intentions behind our actions are what truly matter. He once said, "By oneself is evil done. By oneself is one defiled. By oneself is good done. By oneself is one purified." This quote highlights the personal responsibility each of us carries for our actions. In Buddhism, there is no divine figure or external force that judges our actions or determines our fate. Instead, we are the creators of our own karma, and our intentions directly shape the course of our lives. Take the example of someone giving to charity. If they give with a pure heart, motivated by a desire to alleviate the suffering of others, the positive intention behind their action creates positive karma. This positive karma could manifest in many ways, perhaps bringing them joy, peace, or even good fortune in the future. But if the person gives with an ulterior motive, such as trying to appear virtuous, seeking praise, or trying to gain a tax deduction, the karmic result will be much weaker. In this case, the positive effect of the action is diminished because the intention was not purely selfless. The Buddha often taught through stories to illustrate how karma works in practical terms. One such story involved a man who, in a fit of anger, cursed the Buddha. The Buddha calmly responded to the man, saying, "If you offer me a gift and I don't accept it, who does it belong to?" The man realized that his anger and negative actions didn't affect the Buddha in the slightest, but were harming only himself. In other words, karma operates independently of others' actions. It's not about what others do to us, but how we respond and what we ourselves choose to do. This story serves as a reminder that negative actions driven by anger, hatred, or other afflictive emotions ultimately harm the person who harbors them. The Buddha's equanimity in the face of insult illustrates that our emotional responses are not just reactions to external events, but reflections of our inner state. And it's the inner state that determines the quality of the karma we create. Understanding karma in this way makes it clear that karma is not a system of predestination or fate. It is not about a cosmic law that assigns us to certain circumstances, as if we are helpless victims of a predetermined path. Rather, karma is dynamic and responsive to our choices. Through ethical conduct, mindful living, and meditation, we have the power to shape our karmic path. We are not merely passive recipients of our past actions. We can actively transform our future by making skillful choices in the present. For example, if someone has spent much of their life acting out of greed, selfishness, or ignorance, they may have accumulated negative karma that results in difficult circumstances in the future. However, through mindfulness practice, ethical living, and cultivating wisdom, they can begin to change the trajectory of their life. It's like a person who has spent years cultivating bad habits in their physical body, but with effort and perseverance, they can transform their habits and improve their health. Similarly, in the realm of karma, we can change the quality of our actions and intentions, and in doing so, change the future experiences we will encounter. One of the most powerful ways to transform our karma is through meditation. Meditation allows us to become more aware of our mental states, and by recognizing harmful thought patterns, we can begin to address them before they lead to unwholesome actions. For example, if someone has a tendency to respond with anger when they are frustrated, they can use meditation to develop mindfulness and emotional regulation. Instead of reacting impulsively, they can learn to pause, reflect, and respond with wisdom. Over time, this practice can reduce the creation of negative karma and cultivate positive, wholesome actions. Karma is also deeply connected to the Buddhist practice of compassion. Compassionate actions, whether in the form of generosity, kindness, or forgiveness, create positive karma. These actions not only benefit others, but also enrich the person who performs them. This is because acts of compassion reduce the self-centeredness that creates negative karma, and in their place, they foster a sense of interconnectedness with all beings. When we act with compassion, we are not only helping others, but are also purifying our own hearts and minds. In this way, the practice of compassion serves as both a personal and collective path toward creating a more harmonious world. While karma shapes our current and future lives, it's important to recognize that it is not a deterministic force. It is not a fixed law that dictates every outcome. The Buddha taught that we have the power to change our karma. We are not bound by our past actions. Rather, we are continually creating our future through the choices we make in each moment. This is a powerful and liberating concept, because it means that no matter how much negative karma we may have accumulated in the past, we can begin to change our trajectory at any time. This is where the practice of mindfulness becomes so critical. Mindfulness helps us to observe our thoughts, emotions, and actions without judgment. By developing this awareness, we can begin to recognize when we are acting out of unskillful motivations, such as greed, anger, or ignorance. Once we become aware of these tendencies, we can make the conscious choice to shift our behavior. This process takes time and effort, but the rewards are immense, both in terms of our spiritual growth and our ability to experience greater peace and joy in our lives. In the Buddhist view, karma also has implications for our rebirth. Our actions, thoughts, and intentions not only influence our present life, but they also determine the nature of our future lives. Positive karma can lead to a rebirth in a human realm, or even a heavenly realm, while negative karma can result in a rebirth in a lower realm, such as the animal or hellish realms. However, this does not mean that karma is a simple mechanism of reward and punishment. Rather, it reflects the natural consequences of our actions, and it is ultimately shaped by the intention behind those actions. Karma is also not a final judgment. If someone is reborn into difficult circumstances, it does not mean that their situation is permanent or irreversible. Through practice, meditation, and ethical living, they can transform their karmic path. The Buddha's teachings offer hope that no matter how much suffering or negativity we may have experienced in the past, We have the ability to change our future. Karma, therefore, is not something to be feared or seen as an inescapable trap. It is a tool for personal transformation and liberation. By acting with mindfulness and intention, we can create a future filled with wisdom, compassion, and peace. The ultimate goal of Buddhism is liberation from the endless cycle of rebirth, or samsara, a cycle driven by ignorance, craving, and attachment. The Buddhist teachings provide a profound insight into the nature of this cycle, highlighting how we are all caught in it, whether we are aware of it or not. Samsara is the ongoing process of birth, death, and rebirth, perpetuated by the consequences of our actions, thoughts, and desires. The cycle is marked by suffering, or dukkha, which is inherent in all forms of existence. In the Buddhist worldview, samsara is not a static condition, but a dynamic and repetitive process that keeps us bound to the world of suffering unless we find a way to break free. The Buddhist teachings offer us the path to liberation, the cessation of suffering, and the end of the cycle of rebirth. The first step in understanding liberation is recognizing that samsara is driven by ignorance and craving. Ignorance in this context refers to a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality, particularly the misunderstanding that leads us to believe in a permanent, unchanging self and to become attached to things as though they will bring lasting happiness. This ignorance fuels our craving or desire for things, experiences, and outcomes that we believe will satisfy us, but which ultimately lead to more suffering. The Buddha explained that as long as we remain ignorant of the true nature of reality, and as long as we continue to crave and cling to things, we will remain trapped in samsara. Therefore, the key to liberation lies in the overcoming of both ignorance and craving. The Buddha's solution to this problem is found in the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, a set of guidelines that provide a practical framework for living in a way that diminishes the causes of suffering and ultimately leads to liberation. The Eightfold Path is not a rigid set of rules, but rather a set of practices that help us cultivate wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. By following the Eightfold Path, we gradually weaken the forces of karma and move closer to the state of liberation known as nirvana. The first step in the Eightfold Path is right understanding, or samadhi. This involves understanding the Four Noble Truths, the nature of suffering, its causes, the possibility of its cessation, and the path that leads to its cessation. Right understanding is the foundation of the entire path because it allows us to see things as they truly are. When we understand the impermanence of all things, the nature of suffering, and the law of karma, we can begin to let go of our attachments and desires. For example, someone who truly understands that life is impermanent will be less likely to cling to things or people, knowing that everything is subject to change. This understanding helps to reduce the anxiety and frustration that often come from trying to control what is beyond our control. Right intention, or samma-sankappa, is the second step in the path. This refers to the cultivation of wholesome intentions, such as intentions of kindness, compassion, and renunciation. Right intention involves aligning our thoughts with our values, so that we act with the intention of reducing suffering for ourselves and others. This is not about striving for perfection, but about developing an ethical foundation that allows us to live in a way that is harmonious with our deeper values. A person who practices right intention might decide to refrain from gossiping or engaging in harmful speech, because they recognize that such behavior perpetuates suffering and discord. Right speech, or sammavaka, is the third step. This involves speaking truthfully, kindly, and helpfully. The Buddha emphasized the importance of speech in creating harmony and reducing suffering in the world. Harmful speech, such as lying, gossiping, or speaking harshly, can create negative karma and contribute to the perpetuation of suffering. By practicing right speech, we cultivate trust, respect, and compassion in our relationships. For example, when we speak kindly and truthfully, we are more likely to create an environment of understanding and support, both for ourselves and for others. Right action, or sammakamanta, is the fourth step. This refers to ethical conduct, particularly in how we interact with others and the world around us. Right action involves refraining from actions that cause harm to others, such as killing, stealing, or engaging in sexual misconduct. It also involves cultivating actions that promote the well-being of others, such as helping those in need, being honest, and living with integrity. By practicing right action, we begin to live in alignment with our values and reduce the causes of suffering in our own lives and the lives of others. An example of right action could be volunteering at a shelter for the homeless, where one offers both physical support and emotional care to those in need. Right livelihood, or samma jiva, is the fifth step. This refers to choosing a way of life or occupation that does not harm others and is in line with the principles of ethical conduct. The Buddha encouraged his followers to avoid livelihoods that involve killing, deceiving, or exploiting others. For example, a person who works in a business that profits from harmful practices, such as the production of weapons or substances that cause addiction, would be encouraged to find a more ethical livelihood. Right livelihood is about aligning our work with our values, so that our daily activities do not contribute to the suffering of others or the perpetuation of harmful karma. Right effort, or samavayama, is the sixth step in the Eightfold Path. This involves making a persistent effort to cultivate wholesome qualities and abandon unwholesome ones. Right effort requires us to be vigilant in our practice, constantly striving to improve ourselves and overcome the obstacles that hinder our spiritual growth. It involves both the effort to avoid harmful thoughts and actions and the effort to cultivate positive qualities such as compassion, generosity, and wisdom. For example, someone practicing right effort might actively work to overcome their tendency to get angry easily by developing greater patience and mindfulness. Right mindfulness, or samasati, is the seventh step. This refers to the practice of being fully present and aware of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Mindfulness involves observing our inner and outer experiences without attachment or judgment. By cultivating mindfulness, we can become more aware of the habits and patterns that cause suffering in our lives and begin to break free from them. Mindfulness also allows us to see things clearly, without the distortions of craving or aversion. For example, someone practicing mindfulness might notice when they are feeling anxious, and instead of reacting impulsively, they might pause, breathe, and observe their thoughts with curiosity, recognizing that anxiety is a temporary state and not an essential part of their identity. Right concentration, or sammasamadhi, is the eighth and final step of the Eightfold Path. This refers to the development of deep concentration and mental clarity, particularly through meditation. Right concentration allows us to focus our mind and cultivate the mental stability necessary for insight and wisdom. Through meditation, we can overcome the distractions and distortions of the mind, ultimately achieving a state of inner peace and clarity. The goal of right concentration is to reach the state of jhana, or meditative absorption, which brings the mind to a state of calm, focus, and insight. In this state, the mind is free from the distractions of the ordinary world, allowing for deep insight into the nature of suffering and the path to liberation. The story of the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree offers a vivid illustration of the transformative power of the Noble Eightfold Path. As the Buddha meditated under the tree, he faced numerous challenges, including temptations, distractions, and the profound suffering of the world. But through his practice of meditation, wisdom, and insight, he overcame ignorance and craving, and attained nirvana, the cessation of suffering. Nirvana is not a place or a heavenly realm, but a state of complete freedom from the mental afflictions that cause suffering. It is the extinguishing of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion that keep us bound to samsara. The Buddha's enlightenment demonstrates that liberation is possible for anyone who earnestly follows the path, regardless of their circumstances or past actions. In Buddhism, the ultimate goal is not to escape the world or transcend existence, but to see the world as it truly is and to live in harmony with the impermanence of all things. Nirvana is the state of perfect peace and freedom from suffering, and it is achievable by anyone who is willing to follow the path of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. The Buddha's teachings offer us a way out of samsara, a way to free ourselves from the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. and to live a life of peace, joy, and liberation. Buddhism offers profound teachings on how to approach death, not with fear or avoidance, but with mindfulness, acceptance, and clarity. The inevitability of death is a reality that we all must face. Yet most of us live as if we are immune to it. We often go through our daily lives distracted, caught in the routine, and sometimes even in denial of the impermanence of life. But in Buddhist practice, the recognition and contemplation of death are seen as vital to living a life that is mindful, compassionate, and wise, far from being a morbid focus. The awareness of death in Buddhism is meant to guide us toward living a life of deeper meaning, one that is free from unnecessary attachments and suffering. One of the central practices in Buddhism that prepares us for death is Maranasati, or mindfulness of death. This practice involves regularly reflecting on the certainty of death, but not as a means to cultivate fear or anxiety. Rather, it is meant to create an urgent awareness that life is fleeting, and that every moment is precious. The Buddha taught that death is not something to be feared, but to be accepted as part of the natural order of things. By contemplating death, we are reminded that everything we hold dear, our possessions, relationships, and even our bodies are impermanent, and therefore, we should not cling to them as if they will last forever. This practice encourages us to live fully, without regret, and to align our actions with the deeper values of wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness. When we reflect on death, we begin to ask ourselves, am I living a life that is meaningful? Am I cultivating the qualities that will bring peace when my time comes? This practice serves as a wake-up call, urging us to live with a sense of urgency, not in a panicked way, but in a way that allows us to take full responsibility for our actions, thoughts, and relationships. The awareness of death prompts us to prioritize what truly matters: love, kindness, mindfulness, and the cultivation of wisdom over fleeting desires and superficial concerns. One story that illustrates the transformative power of mindfulness of death is that of a lay disciple of the Buddha, whose life was dramatically changed upon realizing the certainty of death. The disciple, who had once been caught up in the distractions of worldly life, came to understand that death could come at any moment. This realization deeply affected him, and he began to live with a new sense of urgency. He practiced mindfulness throughout his daily activities, being fully present in each moment, and cultivating compassion for others. He made every effort to live with kindness, not only to those around him, but also to himself. He refrained from harsh words and actions, and instead tried to create peace wherever he went. When the moment of his death finally came, he was at peace. He died without fear, knowing that his life had been lived well, in alignment with the Buddha's teachings. This story demonstrates how mindfulness of death can transform our approach to life, helping us live in a way that is more authentic, compassionate, and meaningful. In addition to mindfulness of death, another key Buddhist practice that prepares us for death is meditation. Meditation plays a crucial role in helping us face death with equanimity and clarity. Through regular meditation practice, we develop a deeper understanding of the nature of the mind, the impermanence of all things, and the interconnectedness of all life. Meditation allows us to cultivate inner peace, which is essential when facing the reality of death. By developing the ability to be present with our thoughts and emotions without becoming attached to them, we prepare ourselves to face death without fear or anxiety. Meditation, particularly mindfulness meditation, teaches us how to observe the ebb and flow of thoughts, sensations, and feelings without clinging to them. This is especially important when we contemplate death, as the mind can often become clouded by fear, regret, or attachment. By practicing mindfulness, we train ourselves to observe these mental states with detachment, recognizing them as temporary phenomena rather than as our true selves. In this way, meditation helps us detach from the ego, which is one of the main causes of fear and suffering when we face death. The more we meditate, the more we learn to let go of our attachments, both to our identities and to the things we think will bring us happiness, knowing that they are all impermanent. A powerful example of the role of meditation in preparing for death can be found in the life of a famous Buddhist monk, Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah was known for his deep meditation practice and his ability to maintain a calm, peaceful mind in the face of difficult circumstances. When he was diagnosed with cancer in the later years of his life, he approached his illness with a remarkable sense of acceptance and equanimity. Instead of fearing death or becoming attached to his life, he saw his illness as an opportunity to deepen his practice. His meditation practice allowed him to face death with a sense of clarity and peace, and he passed away peacefully, surrounded by his students. His example shows us that meditation, when practiced consistently, can help us prepare not only for life's challenges, but also for death itself. Another important Buddhist practice that prepares us for death is the cultivation of generosity, or dana. Generosity in Buddhism is not limited to giving material gifts. It extends to the giving of our time, our compassion, and our wisdom. Generosity is seen as a powerful way to reduce the ego and attachments, both of which are major sources of suffering. When we live generously, we cultivate a sense of interconnectedness with others, recognizing that our actions have an impact beyond ourselves. By living a life of generosity, we reduce our attachment to possessions and develop a sense of contentment and peace. Generosity, in a sense, helps us prepare for death by helping us let go of our attachments and by fostering a sense of gratitude for the people and experiences in our lives. There is a famous story in the Buddhist tradition that illustrates the power of generosity. A laywoman, Visakha, was known for her extreme generosity toward the Buddha and his community of monks. One day, she offered a beautiful meal to the Buddha, and after the meal, she asked him how she could ensure that her life would be free from suffering. The Buddha responded by telling her that true happiness comes from cultivating a generous heart, free from attachment to material things. Visakha understood this teaching and continued her practice of generosity, which ultimately brought her peace and a deep sense of fulfillment. Her story illustrates how the practice of giving not only helps us to live a more compassionate life, but also prepares us for the moment of death, when we must let go of everything. The practice of metta, or loving kindness meditation, is also important in preparing for death. Metta is the cultivation of unconditional love and compassion, both for ourselves and others. By practicing loving kindness, we open our hearts to the world and cultivate a deep sense of connection with all living beings. This practice is especially important when facing death because it allows us to die with a heart free of fear, anger, or regret. When we approach death with a heart full of compassion, we are more likely to die in a state of peace, without any lingering attachments or unresolved emotions. A story from the life of the Buddha illustrates the power of loving kindness in preparing for death. The Buddha once visited a village where a man who had been ill for many years was dying. The man's family and friends were grieving, but the Buddha encouraged them to send thoughts of loving kindness to the dying man. Through the power of loving kindness, the man was able to pass away peacefully, without fear or suffering. This story demonstrates how the practice of loving kindness can help us prepare for death by cultivating a heart full of love and compassion, which allows us to face death with grace and peace. The practice of chanting and reciting mantras is another important Buddhist practice that can help us prepare for death. Chanting helps to focus the mind, calm the emotions, and develop a sense of spiritual connection. It is believed that chanting during the time of death can help guide the consciousness of the dying person toward a peaceful state, making the transition from life to death smoother and less fearful. In some Buddhist traditions, monks will chant for the dying person, offering prayers and blessings to help them in their journey toward liberation. The preparation for death in Buddhism is ultimately about cultivating a mindset that is free from attachment, fear, and confusion. Through practices such as mindfulness of death, meditation, generosity, loving kindness, and chanting, we prepare ourselves to face death with wisdom, peace, and clarity. By recognizing the impermanence of life and the certainty of death, we are able to live with more intention and purpose, and ultimately, to pass away peacefully, knowing that we have lived a life that was meaningful, compassionate, and free from regret. Through these practices, Buddhism offers us a way to not only prepare for death, but also to transform the way we live, so that each moment is infused with mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. In Buddhism, death is not something to be feared. It is not seen as a final destination or an irreversible loss, but as an inevitable and natural part of the cycle of life, one that leads to new beginnings. This perspective shifts how we think about death, no longer something to dread, but rather a transition that is intrinsic to the nature of existence itself. This shift in understanding is at the heart of Buddhist teachings on death, rebirth, and karma, offering a profound way to approach both life and death with mindfulness, wisdom, and compassion. The Buddhist teachings on death are built upon the principle of impermanence, the idea that all things in the universe are subject to change, birth, decay, and ultimately, death. Nothing in this world is fixed or permanent. Not our bodies, our relationships, our possessions, or even our thoughts. Just as a river flows continuously, ever changing, so too does our existence. This reality, while it may seem daunting, can actually free us from fear and attachment. When we accept that all things are transient, including our own lives, we are less likely to cling to things that are bound to change. Instead of grieving over their inevitable loss, we can embrace them with gratitude and mindfulness in the present moment. An example of this can be found in nature. Think of a tree that sheds its leaves every fall. We do not mourn the loss of the leaves, but understand that they are part of the natural cycle of growth and renewal. The same principle applies to our lives. Death is not the end, but part of the ongoing flow of life. This wisdom can help us not only come to terms with the idea of our own mortality, but also live more fully, appreciating the fleeting moments we have while cultivating peace and contentment with the knowledge that nothing lasts forever. The understanding of non-self, anatta, is another crucial aspect of the Buddhist view on death. According to the Buddha, what we perceive as the self is not a permanent, unchanging entity. Instead, it is a collection of ever-changing physical and mental components, thoughts, feelings, memories, and sensations that come together to form a temporary identity. Just as the leaves on a tree fall and return to the earth, so too does our sense of self dissolve upon death. The self we hold on to is not as solid or unchanging as we think. And once we realize this, the fear of death diminishes. We begin to see that death is not the end of a fixed self, but a transformation, a transition from one moment to the next. Consider the example of a person who feels deeply attached to their job or their role in life. They may define themselves entirely by these external factors. However, if that person were to lose their job or face a major change in their life circumstances, they may experience a deep sense of loss or identity crisis. In Buddhism, this attachment to a fixed identity is seen as the root of suffering. When we cling to the illusion of a permanent self, we inevitably suffer when that self is threatened or changes. By understanding that we are not bound to any one identity or role, we become freer to live without fear of losing what we think we are. This understanding can also help us approach death with greater peace, knowing that death is merely a change, not the loss of an unchanging self. Another key teaching of Buddhism is the law of karma, which governs not only our actions in this life, but also our future rebirths. Karma, often misunderstood as a simplistic idea of good and bad actions, is much deeper. Karma refers to the intention behind our actions, our thoughts, words, and deeds, and how they shape our future experiences. Every act of kindness, every moment of anger, every word of love or cruelty leaves an imprint on our consciousness, and these imprints follow us into future lives, influencing the circumstances of our rebirths. Karma is not fate. However, it is dynamic and can be changed through conscious effort. We are not bound to a predetermined destiny, but we have the power to transform our future through the way we live today. If we live with kindness, integrity, and mindfulness, we accumulate positive karma that will lead to a better future, whether in this life or the next. Conversely, negative actions, driven by greed, hatred, or ignorance, create suffering and difficulties, both for ourselves and others. An example of this is the story of a man who, in a moment of anger, cursed the Buddha. Instead of reacting with hostility, the Buddha asked him, "If you offer me a gift and I refuse it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man realized that his anger and his harmful actions were his alone, and he was the one who would suffer from them. The Buddha's teaching illustrates that karma is a direct result of our intentions. Just as we are the authors of our actions, we are also the creators of our karma. This understanding can help us approach death not as a final judgment, but as a continuation of our journey, shaped by the choices we make every day. Through mindfulness and ethical living, we begin to dissolve the barriers between ourselves and the world around us. By living with awareness and intentionality, we reduce our attachments to transient things, and we open ourselves to the possibility of living in harmony with the world as it is. Buddhism teaches us that through the cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness, we can begin to transcend the cycle of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and move toward the ultimate goal of liberation, nirvana. Nirvana is often misunderstood as a place or state of eternal bliss. But in Buddhism, it is the cessation of suffering. It is the extinction of the mental fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. Nirvana is not about escaping death, but about transcending the fear and ignorance that bind us to the cycle of suffering. When we are liberated from the attachments and cravings that define our existence, we are able to approach death with a sense of peace, clarity, and wisdom. We no longer view death as something to fear or resist, but as a natural transition, one that does not signify the end of who we are, but the continuation of our consciousness in a different form. One of the key practices in Buddhism to prepare for death is the cultivation of mindfulness, being fully present in each moment. This practice of mindfulness helps us to live without attachment to the past or the future, without clinging to the illusion of permanence. When we live with mindfulness, we see life as it truly is: impermanent, ever-changing, and interconnected. And this awareness of impermanence brings us peace, because it frees us from the fear of loss. By practicing mindfulness, we can prepare ourselves not only for the moment of death, but for every moment of our lives. The Buddha's final words, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence," remind us that death is not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be understood and accepted. Death is a natural part of the cycle of life. And through mindfulness, ethical living, and compassion, we can approach it with wisdom and clarity. By understanding the nature of death, we can live more fully in the present moment, acting with integrity and kindness. In doing so, we not only prepare for death with peace, but also transform the way we live, creating a life free from suffering and full of compassion. This, ultimately, is the path to liberation and freedom from the cycle of rebirth. As we reflect on the Buddha's teachings, we realize that death, far from being something to be feared, is a profound reminder of the preciousness of each moment. Understanding the principles of impermanence, non-self, karma, and rebirth offers a way to approach both life and death with wisdom, clarity, and compassion. By embracing these teachings, we can live with more mindfulness, cultivate more compassion, and ultimately find peace and freedom from suffering, both in this life and in the lives that may follow. Death is not the end, but a transition, and by understanding this, we can live in harmony with the true nature of existence. Alright, so we've journeyed through the Buddhist teachings on life, death, and everything in between. We've seen how death isn't something to fear, but rather something we can approach with wisdom, peace, and even gratitude. And what's more, we've learned how understanding the impermanence of life, the fluid nature of the self, and the law of karma can actually shape the way we live right now. Every action, every word, every thought we have ripples out into the universe and shapes our future in ways we might never fully understand. But here's the best part: you have the power to change your karma, to transform your future, and to live in alignment with your true self. The teachings of the Buddha on rebirth and the cycle of samsara offer us a way to free ourselves from the fear, attachment, and suffering that so often dominate our lives. The path to nirvana, to true peace, is right in front of us. It's in the choices we make every single day. So, how are you going to live your life differently now that you have this knowledge? How can you apply mindfulness, kindness, and wisdom to your everyday? And when that inevitable moment of death comes, will you face it with fear, Or will you face it with peace, knowing that it's just another transition, another chapter in the ever-unfolding story of existence? If you found today's video meaningful, do me a favor, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more content that's all about living a more mindful, meaningful life. Let's continue exploring these deep truths together, and let's make this world a little more peaceful, one step at a time. Remember, all conditioned things are impermanent, so strive on with diligence. Until next time, keep living with awareness, and let's stay curious about the nature of existence.